The maps on the wall were older than many of the men now dying beneath them, their edges frayed, their colors faded by years of cigarette smoke and nervous fingers. Von Rundstedt stood still, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on Normandy. Red arrows marked Allied advances. Blue lines showed German formations that existed more on paper than in reality. 25 days had passed since the beaches were lost. 25 days since the sea itself had seemed to turn against Germany. He could still hear the distant thunder of guns carried through reports and telephone calls, a constant reminder that time was no longer a resource Germany possessed. The room felt heavy, as if the air itself knew what the men inside refused to say aloud. For von Rundstedt, the truth was no longer something to debate. It had settled into his bones with the same certainty as age. He had lived long enough to recognize patterns that younger officers mistook for temporary setbacks. In the Great War, he had watched confident plans crumble under artillery fire and starvation. He had seen generals insist victory was one offensive away, while soldiers froze in trenches and civilians waited for bread that never came. Now, decades later, the same language returned in different uniforms. Reports spoke of heroic resistance and imminent counterblows, yet each line hid another retreat, another village abandoned, another regiment reduced to a name. Von Rundstedt felt less anger than exhaustion. War had stripped him of illusions long ago. What remained was a blunt understanding of limits, and Germany had crossed them. Outside the headquarters, Normandy was a landscape being torn apart inch by inch. Hedgerows that once sheltered cows and farmers now trapped tanks and bodies alike. German infantry fought bravely, often stubbornly, but courage could not stop the relentless pressure of artillery and air power. Allied planes ruled the sky, hunting any movement that dared show itself in daylight. Supply convoys burned on roads before reaching the front. Fuel was rationed like gold, shells counted like coins. Von Rundstedt read casualty lists that grew longer with every sunrise, and he wondered how many more names would be added simply to satisfy pride. The Atlantic Wall had been sold as an unbreakable shield, a line that would hurl invaders back into the sea. Von Rundstedt had never believed it. No wall could stop a determined enemy with control of the air and sea. Yet doubt had no place in the speeches demanded by Berlin. Optimism was mandatory, realism suspect. Now the wall lay behind the Allies, its bunkers captured or bypassed, its promise exposed as propaganda. Standing before the maps, von Rundstedt felt the quiet bitterness of a man proven right, too late to matter. A telephone rang, sharp and insistent, pulling him from his thoughts. Another call from Berlin, another request for explanations dressed as questions. He listened, answered carefully, chose words that could not be twisted into disloyalty. Still, the truth pressed against his teeth, demanding release. When asked what should be done to drive the enemy back, he paused longer than protocol allowed. In that silence lived every calculation he had made, every estimate of strength and weakness. He saw German divisions stretched thin, Allied numbers swelling like a tide. He saw no miracle waiting beyond the horizon. Von Rundstedt thought of the soldiers, boys and old men alike, holding rifles in muddy fields because orders told them to stand. He thought of families in cities that would soon be targets, of trains that no longer ran, of factories bombed into skeletons. He thought of a nation being dragged toward destruction by leaders who mistook stubbornness for strength. The question on the line was simple, but the answer carried the weight of history. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost weary. He did not shout. He did not plead. He said what reason demanded, not what ideology desired. The words were brief, almost shocking in their plainness. "Make peace, you fools." In that instant, the room seemed to freeze. The phrase cut through layers of denial like a blade. It was not an insult born of anger, but a diagnosis born of experience. Von Rundstedt was not surrendering. He was acknowledging reality. The war in the West could not be won. Continuing, it would only multiply the dead. His duty, as he understood it, was not blind obedience but honest counsel, even if it cost him everything. Those words echoed in his mind long after the call ended. He knew how they would be received, how quickly they would be labeled defeatism or worse. The regime did not tolerate voices that challenged its fantasies. Yet von Rundstedt felt an unexpected calm. For the first time since June 6th, he had spoken without restraint. The burden of silence had lifted, replaced by the certainty that he had done what conscience required. Whether anyone listened was no longer within his control. Around him, staff officers avoided his eyes, sensing the shift in the room. Some shared his doubts, but lacked his rank or years to voice them. Others still clung to hope, believing that a decisive blow might yet change everything. Von Rundstedt did not argue with them. Hope was not something he wished to steal, even if he believed it misplaced. He had reached the end of arguments. Facts no longer persuaded those who did not wish to hear them. As evening approached, the sounds of headquarters continued, typewriters clacking, messengers moving briskly, the machinery of war grinding on. Von Rundstedt looked once more at the maps, memorizing the positions as if committing a final testament to memory. He wondered how history would judge this moment, whether his words would be remembered or buried beneath louder slogans. He suspected the latter. Truth often traveled slowly, especially when power stood in its way. He left the room briefly, stepping outside into air that smelled of damp earth and distant smoke. The sky was streaked with clouds lit by the fading sun, peaceful in a way that mocked the violence below. Somewhere to the west, guns fired, shells landed, men died, all according to plans that no longer matched reality. Von Rundstedt closed his eyes and listened, not to the guns, but to the silence between them. In that silence lived the future Germany refused to face. He knew dismissal would come, perhaps sooner than later. His career, built over decades, would end not with triumph, but with rejection. Yet the thought did not trouble him as it once might have. Rank meant little compared to the lives being spent so cheaply. If his removal spared him the need to sign orders he no longer believed in, so be it. He had given his answer. History would take care of the rest. Returning inside, he resumed his place as if nothing had changed. Orders still needed signing, reports still required reading. War did not pause for moments of honesty. Still, something fundamental had shifted within him. The pretense that skill or will could salvage the situation was gone. What remained was the quiet resolve of a man who had seen enough death to recognize when continuing was itself a crime. In the end, his statement was less about strategy than humanity. "Make peace, you fools," was a plea for lives not yet lost, cities not yet ruined, a nation not yet completely destroyed. It was the voice of a soldier who understood that the highest duty was not endless fighting, but knowing when to stop. The guns continued, the maps changed, and the war marched on. But in that quiet room, 25 days after D-Day, von Rundstedt had already reached the war's true conclusion. Berlin responded to bad news the way a wounded animal snaps at shadows, with rage instead of reflection. Messages returned to headquarters thick with exclamation points and certainty, insisting that the situation was difficult but controllable, that the enemy had overextended, that one properly timed counterstroke would shatter the invasion. Von Rundstedt read every line slowly, weighing each claim against the reports on his desk. The contradiction was absolute. On paper, German formations still existed in tidy rectangles and arrows. On the ground, they were fragments, exhausted men holding thin lines while the sky belonged entirely to the enemy. He could almost feel the distance between Berlin and Normandy stretching wider with every telegram, a gulf filled with denial. The Führer's faith in decisive counterattacks bordered on obsession. Orders arrived demanding immediate offensives by armored units that no longer had fuel, crews, or spare parts. Panzer divisions were commanded to move at night to avoid Allied aircraft, yet night movement turned roads into chaos, vehicles colliding, engines breaking down, columns lost in darkness. When daylight came, fighter bombers appeared as if summoned by movement itself, ripping apart anything that dared roll or march. Von Rundstedt knew this was not temporary air superiority, it was total dominance. Germany no longer fought an enemy on land alone, it fought the sky. Staff officers tried to mask the reality with careful phrasing. They spoke of elastic defense and planned withdrawals, words that softened retreat into theory. Von Rundstedt let them speak, understanding the comfort such language provided. But he saw the truth behind the euphemisms. Each withdrawal surrendered ground that could not be regained. Each delay allowed Allied engineers to build airstrips closer to the front, tightening the noose. Time favored the invaders, and every German effort to buy it only paid the enemy interest. Fuel shortages haunted every conversation. Tanks were powerful machines only when they moved. Immobilized, they became steel coffins or stationary targets. Von Rundstedt listened to commanders argue over allocations measured in liters, deciding which units would advance and which would simply wait to be destroyed. The irony was cruel. Germany still possessed some of the finest armored vehicles in the world, yet they stood useless for lack of the simplest resource. Strategy collapsed under logistics, as it always had. The soldiers themselves were beyond reproach in von Rundstedt's eyes. Reports described stubborn defenses, counterattacks launched with grim determination, small units holding positions long after hope of relief vanished. These men fought not for ideology but for comrades beside them, for the instinct to survive another day. Von Rundstedt respected that deeply, and it sharpened his anger at those who treated such sacrifice as an expendable currency. Courage deserved purpose. Here, it was being spent to sustain illusion. Berlin demanded optimism as fiercely as it demanded obedience. Generals who spoke of difficulty were accused of defeatism. Those who spoke of impossibility vanished from favor altogether. Von Rundstedt felt the pressure closing in, a subtle but unmistakable warning that his words had crossed an invisible line. Yet he could not summon fear. What frightened him was not dismissal, but the certainty that Germany was repeating its oldest mistake, confusing will with capability. In meetings, maps were rearranged as if movement of symbols could alter reality. A division erased here, another conjured there, reserves promised that existed only in imagination. Von Rundstedt watched younger officers cling to these exercises with desperate hope. He did not interrupt. To challenge them now would be to tear away the last comfort they possessed. Instead, he spoke when asked, always returning to the same conclusion, expressed with different caution. The strategic situation was untenable. The Eastern Front loomed constantly in his thoughts. Even as Normandy bled the army dry, Soviet forces pressed relentlessly from the east. Germany was fighting a war on two fronts it could no longer sustain, just as it had in 1918. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Back then, leaders had promised final victories until collapse made lies undeniable. Now, the same arc unfolded, accelerated by technology and scale. Von Rundstedt felt as if he were watching history replay itself at double speed. Air power changed everything. Allied bombers struck rail lines, bridges, depots, strangling movement before it reached the front. Repairs took days, sometimes weeks, only to be undone again within hours. Germany's vaunted efficiency dissolved under constant attack. Von Rundstedt understood that even if the front somehow stabilized, the economic war was already lost. Factories could not function, transport could not recover, replacements could not arrive in time. War was no longer decided by heroics alone, but by systems, and Germany's system was breaking apart. Hitler's personal interference compounded every weakness. Orders arrived that ignored terrain, supply, and common sense, demanding advances into positions already scouted by Allied artillery. Commanders were stripped of authority, reduced to messengers carrying impossible instructions. Von Rundstedt had served under many leaders, but never one so determined to micromanage disaster. The Führer's belief in his own intuition over professional judgment transformed strategic errors into fatal ones. Privately, von Rundstedt spoke with trusted colleagues, men old enough to remember when honesty was still possible. They shared his assessment, though few dared express it openly. They spoke in lowered voices, aware that walls had ears. Each conversation ended the same way, with resignation rather than solutions. None of them saw a path to victory, only different roads to defeat. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how much would be destroyed before it admitted it. The propaganda machine continued its work relentlessly. Newspapers promised secret weapons and inevitable reversals. Radio broadcasts spoke of heroic stands and decisive blows just over the horizon. Von Rundstedt wondered how long such messages could hold against reality. Soldiers returning from the front carried stories more persuasive than any speech. Civilians could see the bombed cities, the shortages, the refugees. Belief eroded quietly, replaced by a weary endurance. He felt increasingly isolated, not physically but intellectually. Those above him demanded faith. Those below him demanded relief he could not provide. Between them stood a commander stripped of meaningful choice, tasked with executing a strategy he believed suicidal. The weight of that contradiction pressed on him daily. He had sworn oaths, upheld discipline, obeyed orders, but nowhere in those commitments did he recall a promise to abandon reason. Part 2 of the story lived not in dramatic confrontations, but in this slow, grinding conflict between truth and denial, between what was and what leaders insisted must be. Von Rundstedt stood firmly on one side, even as the machinery of power pushed relentlessly from the other. The outcome of that struggle was never in doubt. Reality always wins. The only question left was how much it would cost before it was finally acknowledged. After his removal, the war did not pause to acknowledge the change. Guns continued to fire, orders continued to flow, and men continued to die at a pace that made individual careers irrelevant. Von Rundstedt faded from the center of events, yet his prediction unfolded with brutal precision. Normandy did not stabilize. It ruptured. Allied forces pushed outward like a flood released from a cracked dam, breaking through German lines that existed only because soldiers refused to abandon one another. The illusion of control collapsed first quietly, then all at once. The German army retreated not as a planned maneuver, but as a necessity forced by overwhelming pressure. Roads filled with wreckage, burned vehicles, abandoned equipment, and exhausted men marching eastward under skies they no longer owned. Every movement was watched, every column vulnerable. Allied aircraft struck with impunity, turning retreat into slaughter. The once proud Wehrmacht, feared across Europe, now fought simply to survive each day. Von Rundstedt, watching from a distance, recognized the unmistakable signs of strategic death. Paris fell with stunning speed. What had been declared an impregnable fortress became a symbol of how hollow German confidence had become. As the city was liberated, the psychological blow echoed far beyond France. If Paris could fall, nothing was truly secure. German civilians heard the news through strained radio broadcasts, wrapped in excuses and deflections, yet the meaning was clear. The war was no longer distant, it was approaching home. On the Eastern Front, the situation grew even more catastrophic. Soviet offensives crushed entire German army groups, advancing hundreds of kilometers in weeks. Losses mounted beyond replacement. The army bled from two directions, unable to seal either wound. Von Rundstedt saw the convergence he had feared since June. The vice was closing, and Germany stood inside it, defiant but powerless. Berlin responded as it always had, with fury and fantasy. Hitler demanded absolute resistance, declaring cities fortresses and condemning any thought of retreat as betrayal. Orders arrived instructing commanders to hold positions until the last man, as if death itself could alter geography. Some obeyed out of loyalty, others out of fear, and many because no alternative remained. The result was predictable. Entire units were annihilated where withdrawal might have saved them for another day. Von Rundstedt heard of these events through fragments, conversations, and delayed reports. Though no longer in command, he could not escape the war's gravity. He felt a deepening sorrow, not for his lost position, but for the wasted lives that confirmed his warning too late. Each collapse, each encirclement, echoed his earlier conclusion. Peace had been the only rational option. Now even that was slipping beyond reach. Germany itself began to fracture under the strain. Cities burned under relentless bombing, their centers reduced to ruins. Civilians crowded cellars, shelters, and refugee columns, moving without clear destinations. Industry faltered. Transportation collapsed. Hunger spread quietly, then openly. The home front, once promised security and victory, now mirrored the chaos of the battlefields. The war had come home in full. Within the regime, paranoia replaced strategy. Suspected defeatists were arrested, interrogated, executed. Officers were forced to swear renewed oaths, pledging loyalty not to Germany but to Hitler personally. Von Rundstedt understood the significance of this shift. It was no longer a war fought for national survival, but for the preservation of a single man's authority. In such a war, reason had no place. Even as defeat loomed, Hitler clung to the belief that something would change. A new weapon, a political fracture among the Allies, a miracle born of willpower alone. These hopes were not plans but prayers, and prayers do not stop armies. Von Rundstedt had seen leaders succumb to this delusion before, mistaking faith for strategy. It had ended badly then, it would end worse now. The Ardennes offensive briefly reignited those illusions. A surprise attack, carefully prepared and brutally executed, achieved initial success. For a moment, maps shifted. Arrows moved westward, and Berlin proclaimed proof of inevitable victory. Von Rundstedt watched with grim familiarity. He knew the limits of the effort before it began. Fuel shortages, Allied air power, and overwhelming reserves would doom it. Temporary success only delayed the inevitable and multiplied the cost. When the offensive collapsed, it took with it the last reserves of German strength. What remained was exhaustion. Units fought on with the mechanical obedience of men who no longer believed in outcomes, only in orders. Discipline held where hope had died. Von Rundstedt recognized this as the final stage of a lost war, when momentum belongs entirely to the enemy and resistance becomes ritual. As 1,000 945 dawned, the end approached with terrifying speed. Allied armies crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces surged toward Berlin. The geography of Germany itself became a battlefield, its towns and villages reduced to positions to be defended or abandoned. Von Rundstedt listened as names he had known all his life became sites of destruction. The abstraction of war dissolved. This was no longer about fronts or strategies, it was about survival amid collapse. Hitler's authority shrank, even as his demands grew more extreme. Orders were issued that could not be carried out, punishments decreed for failures that were unavoidable. Officers were executed for retreating from ruins. Boys and old men were pressed into service, armed with little more than desperation. The state devoured itself in the name of resistance. Von Rundstedt reflected often on responsibility. He had served the regime, commanded armies, and obeyed orders. He had also warned, advised, and spoken truth when asked, was that enough? History would judge him alongside others, measuring action against consequence. He did not absolve himself. Yet he knew that silence would have been worse. His words, though ignored, stood as record that not everyone had been blind. Berlin fell amid fire and ruin. The city that had demanded faith until the end now lay broken, its promises buried beneath rubble. Hitler died in isolation, clinging to fantasies, even as his world collapsed. Germany surrendered shortly after, shattered, occupied, and exhausted beyond measure. The war ended not with triumph or dignity, but with relief that the killing had finally stopped. Make peace, you fools, was never just about 1944. It was about every moment when leaders choose illusion over reason and demand sacrifice without purpose. It echoes beyond Normandy, beyond Germany, beyond one war. It asks whether courage lies in fighting on or in knowing when to stop.